I would like to provide some context to the conversation that I present here. I shared the material in class, but here I may be able to be a little bit more clear, as well as extend on a few questions and directions that were introduced in our Zoom class. So I titled this Towards a Definition of Terms. And the following terms are the ones that I have been seeing kind of keep recurring in our papers, in our discussions, in our readings. The term culture, community, society, education, identity, freedom, power. The list can be extended. I only provide these just to reference some of the terms that may be appropriate to our subject. And one of the things that I notice is that a lot of the readings themselves, the authors, seldom define the terms. I find that when terms are not defined, I have difficulty finding the range of application. Today, I'm going to be highlighting the term culture and maybe a little bit of a community, but my goal is to provide a definitional framework for the concept of culture, specifically rooted in the field of anthropology, but hopefully also extend to the application to the other respective fields such as education, philosophy, history, and the respective humanities. The term culture is referenced extensively. Some may argue that it's referenced so much that it doesn't have to be defined. I want us to pause and consider the difficulty in using a term that is understood so well by so many people that we no longer emphasize definitions. What if we push back and demand definition? We do so because in operationalizing the term, outlining the elements that define this concept, we may be able to find new directions of analysis. The definition that I use in my work is rooted in the field of anthropology. The field of anthropology, at its core, is a field dedicated to understanding what it means to be human. The unit of analysis that holds the field together is the human being. There are 4 parts to the field: archaeology, biological anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and social cultural anthropology. Each of these elements is looking at one aspect of what it means to be human. So humans speak, we have linguistics. Humans hold a body, we have biological anthropology. Humans produce an infrastructure, a world that expresses their existence, we have archaeology. And the field that I am rooted in is in the cultural aspect. And to address the cultural aspect means to address the behaviors, the ideas, all of the acquired traits that provide a structure for understanding the world as a human being. I would like to begin by using a definition that is most likely to be shared in an introduction to cultural anthropology class. The definition is from 1871 by E.B. Tyler. It states, "Culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, law, morals, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by human as a member of society." I would like you to highlight the words acquired and member, because these keywords emphasize, one, that culture is something that is learned, it's picked up, it's accessed in relation to membership within a society, a group, a community. A more recent definition from 2002 comes from Penn Handwerker. Here, culture is defined in this way. Culture is the knowledge people use to live their lives and the way in which they do so. This definition is much broader and I believe much more compatible with the common usage of the term culture, that it is simply something you do, something you live, something you express. It is accurate, but I find that this definition is harder to use in most of my work. It's harder to use because it's so general. it makes it a little bit harder to talk about the politics of culture. The definition that I've been using more recently is one that is similar to E.B. Tyler's definition, in that it presents culture as holistic and integrated, and then goes further to itemize the elements of culture. So for me, culture is the holistic and integrated, comprehensive collection of ideas, practices, information systems, emotions, languages, and material expressions that instruct people how to be a human being as a member of a structural community and or active communities. And this comes out of a course that I've been teaching for several years titled Perceptions of Human Differences. I would like to break down the definition of culture that I use into its respective segments. The holistic and integrated component I will address at a later point. If you're following along on the slide, the definition has 4 parts, A, B, C, and D, with subparts under B, itemized under Roman numerals 1, 2, 3. The purpose of presenting the concept of culture in a way that is composed of at least 4 major elements with respective pieces that are essential as necessary parts of the whole is to hopefully provide a definition that serves as a tool of analysis so that there is a much more accessible way of using the concept of culture in our research, analysis, and application. The subject of culture is both easy and difficult. It's difficult because the definition of culture changes with people and context. Here, I am trying my best to use a very anthropological context. And I begin by emphasizing that culture is a comprehensive collection of items. So that ideas, practices, information systems, and emotions are itemized in a separate line from languages and material expressions, only to assist in the itemization of these characteristics. But in reality, they're never separate. And I'm also trying my best to itemize them separately so that they can coincide to the respective fields of anthropology. Anthropology has the field of social cultural studies or social culture anthropology, linguistic anthropology, archaeology, and biological anthropology. So that the comprehensive collection of ideas and practices, behaviors, may be assigned as related to cultural anthropology, may be assigned to cultural anthropology, languages to linguistic anthropology, the material expressions, the things that humans manufacture as part of being human, clothing, buildings, tools, can be assigned to the specialization of archaeology. And it leaves us with biological anthropology. How does that field interact with the definition of culture? I believe biological anthropology, the concept of emotions, and even the cognitive processing of ideas may be addressed through biological anthropology. The way that culture leaves an imprint on the body can look at how class leaves an imprint, maybe in nutrition, injury, in the physical remains of the human being. When addressing culture as a comprehensive collection of items that are ideas and physical practices, but also linguistic and material expressions, we can add this point that all of these things that we do within our respective cultural spaces, and let me even extend it further, our respective cultural worlds, are part of an instruction. We learn them, are acquired through these experiences and interactions with other people. And I want to emphasize something that for me is really important, that these practices are relatively arbitrary. In one society, you may be allowed to use a color that is assigned to a gender social construct, and that same color will be denied in another community. So the color is arbitrary. What is important is that that color is part of an instruction mechanism on how to be a full human being within that respective space. So to me, the important part is this, that when we talk about culture, it is a collection of things that we believe and we do and we make, but they are guided as a set of instructions on how to be human. So to emphasize that relationship even more, culture is what defines us as human. So if culture is an expression of us being human, we must give credit to the fact that humans do not exist alone. In fact, humans need other people. And that collection of people can be the beginning of what we will call community. So in the process of defining culture, I want to emphasize that culture is an instruction mechanism of how to be human as part of a member of a community. So there's at least two types of communities that we can consider. One, a structurally outlined community, or an active, free, organic community. Structurally outlined communities can be businesses, institutions, pre-existing ideologies of difference. These can be the larger historic ways that we have built a sense of aggregating people. And active communities are the free, organic ways that we build sense of unity in our daily interactions. I can be part of a club that in coming together starts building its own way of thinking about ourselves, speaking about ourselves, and expressing ourselves physically. But there's no official guideline. It's just our own sense of holding our community together actively that will produce the cultural expressions. When we address the concept of culture, it's important to consider the model that is being used. I notice that there's a pattern of at least two ways of considering culture. One of them speaks of culture as something that is additive, compartmentalized, and cut up in points of reality, so that culture is something I do. I can go eat something, and that's entering culture. I can wear something, and that's part of my culture. But I can take it off, and I am no longer engaging with culture. That is not the model that I use. Instead, let's return to the definition and consider culture as holistic, immersive, and complete. So, for example, music. If I access a song, and that song is presented as an expression of my culture, while I am listening to it, I may be feeling that I am accessing my culture. And that song connects me to a cultural world or a cultural space. In reference to the visual, that circle can be the cultural space. But what if culture is immersive? So that music is an expression of a space that I exist within and immerses me in a complete reality. So that song relates to my literature relates to my religion. The holistic and immersive model of culture does not imply that culture is limiting. Culture is open, and we are able to enter different spaces. But I want to emphasize that the concept of culture that I am highlighting is a term that is addressing our immersive reality of community membership that instructs us with ideas, patterns, and material expressions on how to be a human being. To continue to highlight culture as holistic and integrated, we can use a shorthand concept by simply stating that culture is everything in society. And to say everything is not to be exaggerated, but to consider that society is a product of our manufacture. So I'll quote Max Weber: "Humans are an animal suspended in webs of significance that humans themselves have spun." A more accurate way of understanding culture is to consider that the different aspects of culture are all integrated. If culture can be broken up into different items, such as food, gender, clothing, music, economy, art, education, governance rules, language, tools, religion, and etc. From here, we can consider how religion can be integrated or connected to art. Or we can study music as its own genre, but also consider language as an element that is integrated to music, so that the removal of one language will affect the musical expression of the community as well. To consider the culture elements as interconnected takes in a direction of considering culture as a type of web, where touching one end ripples effects on another. The visual that I present is incomplete. The linear connections are too limiting. The tools that we make are expressions of our gender construct. The education systems that we support are related to the economic needs, but my goal here is to express a visual format that signals the way that culture is composed of many elements that cannot be separated, and more importantly, that provide a cultural world for us to exist within. As we work through outlining a much more finite definition of culture, we can introduce this question: where does culture come from? My response is based on the assessment of culture as a product of being human. It is what happens when we get together and we interact as human beings in community. So culture as an expression of ideas, behaviors, languages, material artifacts can also be produced out of institutions and systems that humans build. I think of systems and institutions as infrastructures, so that a corporation may be an abstract legal concept, but is also an infrastructure with a bureaucratic outline of organization that may take on expressions in protocols, but also buildings, cubicles, paperwork, dress format. All of those things put together can be given credit as also being responsible for the production of cultural ideas, cultural behaviors, cultural languages, and cultural material expressions. Another question that is often asked is, why do we need culture? We may consider the function of culture at this point. I will not be exhaustive in my attempt to explain the function of culture, but we can begin by thinking about culture as something that emerges to meet human needs, to provide for our physical, psychological, and even emotional needs. For example, our food practices vary throughout the globe, yet they all provide the nutrition necessary for our bodies to continue. Culture provides also psychological reassurance. Here I'm using the word psychological in a very broad context, so it may be psychological/intellectual. As humans have questions, cultural stories provide answers. But culture also provides an emotional support. issues of stability, security, community building are part of the human needs. When I think of the coffee shop, for example, we can always get coffee at home, and that can supply our physical need. Do we go to a coffee shop to be with community? Does the coffee shop provide a sense of stability to our routine? So the coffee shop has its own cultural formats of the things you will do there that you cannot do elsewhere. We may even consider giving credit to something that may be called coffee shop culture, that emerges out of this organic gathering of people that repeats itself to the point that we start producing a set of behaviors around it, but also out of an infrastructure that is built for us to enter. So we may credit the interaction of our own organic creativity with that is outlined by the infrastructure. Extending on the function of culture, we can give credit to culture as this term that is referencing an expression that is itemizing the collection of ideas, practices, behaviors, everything that we do as humans, but can be also thought of as a type of supplement that extends on the limitations of the human body and the human mind. The human body is consistent. The human body is consistent. There is one human body. The racialized construct is just that, a false assumption that has been built historically to produce inequality. But the biological unit that we call human being is one, and it is surprisingly limited. Our bodies cannot take extreme heat nor extreme cold, yet we live in both temperatures. Culture has allowed us to exceed our physical limitations by manufacturing shelter as well as clothing that allow us to survive in extreme temperatures that are outside of our physical capabilities. I introduced this aspect as well, that culture is the library of our community. If I emphasize language, I can archive the stories by sharing them. I do not have to remember everything because I can write it down. Again, cultural expressions allow me to exceed my limitations. But also, in me remembering things that were told to me, allow that story to be archived in me. When I think about the infrastructure that surrounds us, that's a physical expression of millions of sources of information. We may experience a city full of buildings and not give credit to the math, to the language, to the art, to the foods, to the gender, religion, economic patterns, social political organization, educational institutions, all of the different knowledge systems that are available and archived in that library that we may associate with that physical building, but ultimately is an example of a culture. As we get closer to defining culture, we can ask the following question. Can you have more than one culture? The straightforward answer is yes. But I would like us to expand further into questioning why you can have more than one culture. But be more specific in itemizing the how, the process in which the concept of culture can exist in multiple domains, yet being tied to a single body. To rephrase, how can I as one body have more than one culture at the same time? In pursuing the question of how a single body can exist in multiple cultures. We can find some answers by considering the relationship between cultural expressions or cultural domains and grounded communities. If culture is a product of community, then we can ask, how many communities can we build? How many circles do we belong to where someone knows us and we know them? Where someone cares about us and we care about them? Where someone depends on us and we depend on them? We can also extend the question on the different types of communities that are built. Some are free in the sense that the freedom is based on our own agency and not on systems of coercion, histories of control and oppression. Let me return to a statement that I presented earlier where I stated that the term culture is used so often that to me it provides insight into a common sense understanding of this concept, to the point that most of us don't really have to define it in order to use it. And I want to be supportive of the fact that we can use this term so openly and carry so much meaning forward without having to be so specific on the parameters of the definition. But I repeat myself here. I find it difficult to use certain terms that appear well defined, but in fact are seldom defined. And I've been outlining the term culture, but now I place the scope of questioning toward the actual word community or communities. And as we consider this riddle of how can one person, one body, have multiple cultures at the same time, we were able to create some semblance of clarity by understanding that culture is associated to communities, and if you exist in multiple communities, then you probably exist in multiple cultures. Well, how many communities do we have? Let's think about the nation state as one imagined community. Here I'm referencing Benedict Anderson's analysis on imagined communities. We can think of regions, Southwest, East Coast. We can think of institutions, universities, workplaces, government agencies, and we can also think of master status categories. This term is referencing the manufactured ways that we have understood diversity. The question of age, gender, racialized bodies, sexual orientation, the very concept of ability/disability. These terms have a high probability of referencing a sense of association, a sense of community. But then we can also extend our sense of community to these free groups. Do you have a family? Do you have a neighborhood where you feel grounded in community, in these very rich relationships of interconnectedness and even interdependence that are not hierarchical, that are not structured through patterns of control? These free communities are based on our own control, on our own power, on our own agency. My intent in this conversation was to approximate a definition of culture so that we can assess how a much more finite definition of the concept of culture can serve as a tool of application within fields such as education, ethnic studies, legal studies, philosophy, the arts, and the other respective humanities. Within the context of our course, we could be more direct in asking the following question. What is the application of investing in a more finite definition of culture? I feel that there are a lot of words that we use within the field of education in particular that carry different definitions, and the use of different definitions can make our work more difficult. The words culture, race, education, deculturalization, and multiculturalism are highly referenced in the literature, in our classes, in our work. And it can become awkward and frustrating to know that there is a way of approximating a much more finite use of the terms. I will not expand on all of them, but I would like to pause briefly to emphasize, for example, race as a social construct is very different than race as a belief system that we humans are biologically divided into separate groups that are commonly referenced as color codes. Also, the term education is used extensively, yet we seldom get an opportunity to ask, what do people mean when they say and write the word education? I don't like the word education. I prefer to be specific in identifying schools, also itemize the institutions of information management or knowledge systems. And the terms deculturalization and multiculturalism, hopefully I'll get an opportunity to expand on them at a later point. But for now, I return to the question, what is the application of this emphasis in trying to approximate a more finite definition for the term culture? My response to the question, what is the application of searching for a more finite definition of the term culture, actually leads me to generate more questions. I pose these 3 questions. How is education an expression of specific culture or cultures and or society? How does education actively manage culture or cultures? And finally, how do institutions of information management impose, confine, and or control cultural probabilities? My work in education is rooted in the field of anthropology. My dissertation research addresses school culture, middle school culture, specifically looking at an urban context, Los Angeles, and assessing the school context as a microcosm of the macro, social, economic, political outlines. So when I address the term education, I apply a very broad analysis, one that considers education as universal. Every society has education, but not every society has built a school. So the distinctions of different social-political organizations will become important in the analysis of education. We have a band society, tribe, chiefdoms, and the state. Connected to the state is the nation state. Our society, the one we navigate daily, is a nation state. So that when we apply analysis of education, we must highlight where that education system is based. Our investment in outlining the term culture helps us consider how education actively manages culture. And here, the term education is more specifically addressing schools, institutions of information management, and knowledge systems. The countless hours that we have invested within these institutions that, as an openly recognized objective, is to manage information, can be connected to the domain of culture. In fact, I believe it's an understatement to say can be connected. If culture is that holistic, integrated collection of ideas, practices, languages, material expressions that are a product of being human, but also can emerge from our interactions with institutions, then it's not a question of does education actively manage cultures, but instead, how does education actively manage culture? And that question has been covered extensively. Surprisingly, it does not mean that we stop asking it. In fact, I believe there is still a lot of work to be done because we can add new directions at this point. We can capitalize on the work of previous scholars and add our individual insights. I recall that Tony was discussing the distinction between a philosophy that addresses possibilities from a philosophy position that is committed to considering probabilities. And during our class conversation, I posed this question to the group. How do institutions of information management impose limits, confine, and/or control cultural probabilities? This question goes to the core of the things I care about in terms of the field of education, the field that addresses schools as institutions of information management. My address of culture as a term is one that is committed to cultural sovereignty, the rights of every human to live in community under their right to express what is important to them. And school systems are not the places that have demonstrated tolerance and support for infinite cultural probabilities. In fact, schools do the opposite. Schools produce limited probabilities. If we take an inventory of our respective educational journeys, many of us have been successful, but all of us have experienced degrees of cultural subtraction. As we think about our respective roles within the field of education, I think it becomes a little bit difficult to contemplate on our participation in reducing cultural probabilities, especially as many of us express a commitment to respect difference, to respect the rights of individuals to be themselves in contrast to the expectations of those in power. Yet many of us teach multiple languages while knowing that only one of them is the one that will be given credit. Or we speak of respecting cultural expressions while understanding that within our institutions of work, there is a clear set of guidelines for the type of expressions that are not only tolerated, but actually systematically instructed. I don't have a good way of closing this conversation other than repeating that the goal of this presentation was to provide some content so that we can walk towards a much more finite definition of culture.